The annual Harrington family reunion was held, as always, at the flagship restaurant of Ironclad Dining Group in downtown Chicago. For the past 7 years, this exact place had hosted the event, almost like a shrine to the family's success. 300 relatives filled the private upstairs banquet hall, surrounded by dark mahogany walls, golden accent lighting, and crystal chandeliers that quietly reminded everyone who owned the building. I sat at table 14, gently pushing my grilled salmon around the plate, already bracing myself. Dessert had just been served, Ironclad's famous triple-layer chocolate tart, and my father was on his third glass of Cabernet. That was usually the signal. "You know what I love about these reunions," he said loudly, making sure our entire table heard him. "Seeing how far the family business has come. Just look around. This is what success actually looks like." My cousin Logan, head of marketing for Ironclad Dining Group, lifted his glass. 25 restaurants across 5 states. And that's just the beginning. Cheers erupted around the table. Aunt Marianne, who ran human resources, smiled proudly. Our expansion into Michigan alone exceeded projections. 2 new locations this quarter. Then Uncle Victor Harrington, the CEO and self-appointed family legend, stood up. The room slowly quieted. "Family," he said, spreading his arms wide, "Ironclad isn't just a business. It's a legacy. Built by Harringtons. Managed by Harringtons. Owned by Harringtons." Applause thundered through the hall. Then his eyes landed on me. "Of course," he continued smoothly, "not everyone in the family feels called to entrepreneurship. Some people prefer simpler paths." Every head turned. I wore my standard reunion outfit, a modest black dress and flats I'd bought on sale. I worked as a library assistant for the Chicago Public Library. Not exactly ironclad material. My father didn't miss the opening. "Take my daughter Claire," he said, gesturing toward me. 28 years old and completely uninterested in business. Perfectly happy shelving books instead of building wealth. My cousin Natalie, Ironclad's finance director, laughed. "Not everyone can handle real pressure, Uncle Richard. Business takes a special mindset." Dad nodded. "Exactly. Claire's always been more of a follower. Some people are just meant for support roles." I kept eating my dessert, expression calm. This routine was familiar. Every family gathering came with a reminder of where I ranked. And no one at that table had any idea that for the last 7 years, Ironclad Dining Group had survived because of me. The conversation around the table rolled on without me, as if I'd already faded into the background. Uncle Victor launched into a lecture about market positioning and brand dominance, his voice full of confidence that bordered on arrogance. "The restaurant industry is all about precision," he said. "Margins, logistics, scalability. You need vision to survive." Cousin Logan leaned forward eagerly. "And investor management. Without structured capital flow, Ironclad wouldn't be where it is today." That was when I nearly laughed into my coffee. My father reclined in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment. "That's what I've tried explaining to Claire for years. Business isn't for everyone. It requires ambition." Aunt Marianne offered a thin smile in my direction. "Libraries are important too. Someone has to keep things organized." The condescension sat heavy in the air. Cousin Evan, who ran Ironclad's procurement division, raised his glass. "To those who took risks. To the builders of real wealth." Applause rippled across the table again. Then my father turned fully toward me. "Claire, you really should think long-term. There's no growth in your line of work. No leverage. No future. Every face at the table waited for my response. This was the part where I was expected to look embarrassed. Apologetic. Small. I placed my fork neatly beside my plate and smiled. "You're right, Dad," I said calmly. "I'll leave success to my cousins." The relief was immediate. Hates nodded. Evan patted my shoulder as if I'd finally accepted reality. "That's maturity," he said. "Knowing your limits." I excused myself and walked away from the table, weaving through clusters of relatives still celebrating Ironclad's dominance. The staff moved flawlessly, clearing plates, refilling glasses, executing systems I knew better than anyone in that room. For 7 years, I had watched every operational change Ironclad made. Every menu revision. Every aggressive expansion. Every risky staffing shortcut. Because while my family thought I didn't understand business, I had been studying their business more closely than they ever had. I locked myself in a restroom stall and pulled out my phone. "Angela," I said quietly when my call connected, "it's Claire." My fund manager didn't sound surprised. "I was expecting your call. I want to initiate full liquidation of the Ironclad position." There was a brief pause. "Claire, that's a majority stake. Timing-wise, Q3 projections are strong." "I'm aware. This will trigger the controlling shareholder clause. The board will be notified immediately." "I'm ready." Another pause. "Without your capital structure, Ironclad will be insolvent within 60 days. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, calm, composed, underestimated. "I understand the consequences." "If you're sure," Angela said carefully, "I'll begin the process." "I'm sure." When I returned to the dining room, my family was still planning an empire that no longer had a foundation. I slid back into my seat just as coffee was being poured, my expression neutral while my relatives mapped out Ironclad's future with impressive confidence. Cousin Logan was already talking numbers. "The Nashville rollout is going to be massive," he said. "We've identified 10 prime locations for the next 18 months. Uncle Victor nodded approvingly. "The Southeast market is underserved. Ironclad is positioned to dominate if we move fast." Fast. That was the problem. I stirred my coffee slowly, listening. They spoke like people who believed capital was infinite, like people who had never worried about cash flow because they'd never had to. Expansion had become their religion, and no one questioned whether the foundation could support it. My phone vibrated softly in my lap. "Angela, board notification sent. Expect responses within a few hours." I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked around the room. 300 smiling faces. Executives, managers, department heads, all related by blood, all convinced they owned the success surrounding them. The reunion ended around 10 that night with the traditional group photo in front of the Ironclad logo. I stood in the back row beside my cousins, all of us smiling for the camera. No one noticed the irony. The next morning, I was back at the library, reshelving fiction when my phone began ringing non-stop. I ignored the first call. Then another. And another. Uncle Victor. Logan. Aunt Marianne. By lunchtime, I had 12 missed calls and a flood of messages. I listened to one voicemail out of curiosity. "Claire," Uncle Victor said, his voice tense, "something's happened. Our primary investor has liquidated their position. No warning. No explanation. We need an emergency family meeting." Another message from Logan read, "Do you know anything about a company called North Shore Equity? They just pulled everything." Aunt Marianne left a voicemail too. "Claire, I know you're not involved in business, but we're in a funding crisis. Please call me. I deleted them all. At 3 o'clock, while I was reading Green Eggs and Ham to a circle of preschoolers, my phone buzzed again. Dad, emergency family meeting tonight. 7 p.m. Everyone must attend. I typed back calmly. I'm working late. Inventory. His reply came instantly. This is more important than books. I stared at the message for a moment before responding. I'm not part of the family business. Remember. He didn't reply. That evening, while the Horringtons panicked around a conference table, I finished my shift, locked up my desk, and walked home through the quiet Chicago streets. Ironclad Dining Group had 60 days left. The emergency meeting happened without me, but the fallout reached me anyway. By midweek, every conversation I had with my phone felt heavier than the last. My mother called first, early Wednesday morning. Claire, she said softly, your father is extremely stressed. Apparently, Ironclad's main investor pulled out completely. They have 60 days to secure new funding or shut everything down. That sounds serious, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. I'm sure Uncle Victor will handle it. He's very good at business. There was a pause. But they need almost $200 million. And no one understands why an investor would walk away from a profitable company. Maybe they had reasons, I said. Investors usually do. On Thursday, Logan called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Claire, he said, skipping pleasantries, I know you're not involved in Ironclad, but do you know anyone who might be interested in investing? We're reaching out to everyone. I smiled to myself. I don't really move in investment circles, Logan. I'm just a librarian. Right, he said awkwardly. But maybe someone you know. True work. I nearly laughed. If I hear anything, I'll let you know. Friday afternoon, Uncle Victor himself called. His voice was different, quieter, cautious. Claire, I'm going to ask you something that might sound strange. Okay. The investor who pulled out, North Shore Equity. The initials are N.E. Your parents' names are Nathan and Evelyn. He hesitated. Is there any chance you know something about this? I let the silence stretch. Uncle Victor, I said finally, that sounds pretty far-fetched. Where would I get $200 million? I know, he sighed. I know. It's just the timing. The liquidation happened the day after the reunion. Coincidences happen. Yes, he said slowly. They do. 2 weeks later, Ironclad Dining Group filed for bankruptcy protection. Without continued funding, they couldn't sustain operations across 25 locations. The newest restaurants closed first, followed by older ones. More than 400 employees were laid off. Logan, Natalie, and Evan all lost their executive roles. And Miriam drained her retirement savings just to stay afloat. Uncle Victor went from CEO to damage control overnight. My father called me repeatedly during that time. We don't understand how this happened, he said during one call. We were profitable. Everything looked strong. Maybe the investor saw something you didn't, I suggested gently. He fell silent. By the end of the month, Ironclad was a name people whispered instead of celebrated. And the family that once measured worth in profits was finally learning what it felt like to be powerless. The final blow came 6 weeks after the reunion. I was eating lunch in the library staff room when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The Chicago Herald had published an article about Ironclad's collapse. Local restaurant chain files for bankruptcy after major investor withdrawal. The article quoted several Harrington family members. Uncle Victor admitted they never understood why their investor had walked away. Logan claimed the decision felt sudden and arbitrary. Not a single one of them mentioned accountability. I finished my sandwich, folded the paper napkin, and went back to work. That evening, my father called. "Claire," he said, his voice careful, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." "Okay." "At the reunion, when I talked about your career. When I said you'd never amount to anything in business, were you upset?" I considered the question. "Dad," I said slowly, "you've been saying things like that my entire adult life. If I got upset every time, I'd never stop being upset." He exhaled. But this time was different. It was in front of everyone. Yes. It was. There was silence on the line. And the very next day, he continued, "Our investor pulled out." "Coincidences happen," I said calmly. "Do they?" he asked. "Because North Shore Equity. N.E., Nathan and Evelyn. Your parents' initials." He hesitated. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of my apartment. IKEA furniture. Library books stacked on my coffee table. A quiet life that didn't look like money. "Dad," I said, "you've spent 10 years explaining to everyone that I don't understand business. That I lack ambition. That I should leave success to my cousins. Yes, so why would you think I'd be capable of secretly controlling a $200 million company?" Another long silence. "Because," he finally said, "someone who could destroy a business like that overnight would have to be extremely intelligent. Extremely patient. Extremely strategic." I smiled faintly. "Are you saying you were wrong about me?" "I think," he said quietly, "that I might have been." It was the first time I'd ever heard him admit that. And somehow, it felt heavier than all the accusations combined. There was a long pause on the line, the kind where words are no longer the problem, fear is. "Claire," my father said carefully, "North Shore Equity, was that you?" I stood by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. In the distance, I could still see the darkened office building that had once housed Ironclad Dining Group's headquarters. The sign had already been removed. "Dad," I said slowly, "if I were North Shore Equity, that would mean I spent 7 years quietly funding the family business while you told everyone I wasn't smart enough to understand entrepreneurship." Silence. "It would mean I sat through holidays and reunions while you mocked my career, knowing my money paid everyone's salaries." Still silence. "And it would mean you were completely wrong about my abilities for my entire adult life." He exhaled shakily. "Claire," he whispered, "are you North Shore Equity?" I closed my eyes. "Dad, what do you think?" The truth settled between us, heavy and unavoidable. "I think," he said finally, "that I owe you the biggest apology of my life." "Yes," I replied quietly. "You do." "And I think," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "that I've just learned the most expensive lesson I'll ever learn." I allowed myself a small smile. Business lessons usually are. The good ones, anyway. After that conversation, something shifted. The anger didn't vanish overnight, but the power imbalance did. My father stopped speaking at me and started listening to me. For the first time, he asked about my work at the library, not as a joke, but with genuine interest. We started having dinner together once a month. No extended family. No business talk. Just two people learning how to speak honestly for the first time. One evening, he said, "I've been thinking about Ironclad." I raised an eyebrow. "That's dangerous." He smiled weakly. "I think investors want to feel respected. Valued. Not taken for granted." I'd agree. If someone had supported a business for years, he continued, the least the owners could do is treat that person well, even if they didn't look powerful on the surface. "Especially then," I said. He nodded slowly. "I wish I'd understood that earlier." So did I. But some lessons don't arrive gently. Some of them cost millions. And pride. 3 months after Ironclad Dining Group collapsed, the Harrington family was still picking up the pieces. Most of my cousins had found new jobs, though none anywhere near the executive positions they once took for granted. Logan moved into a mid-level marketing role at a regional firm. Natalie accepted a finance position that reported to someone younger than her. Evan switched industries entirely. Uncle Victor became a consultant, offering advice to restaurant groups that politely listened and rarely followed it. My father and I continued our monthly dinners. We never spoke directly about North Shore equity, but everything about our relationship had changed. He listened. He asked questions. He treated my thoughts like they carried weight. One evening, he said, "Claire, if you ever decide to get involved in business openly, I hope you'll consider letting me participate." I smiled. "As what?" "Maybe," he said carefully, "as a junior partner. Someone who listens more than he talks." I didn't answer right away. Some partnerships need time to heal. 6 months later, I made my first public investment, small, intentional, and personal. A struggling independent bookstore in my neighborhood was facing a rent increase that would have forced it to close. I introduced myself simply, Claire Harrington, investor and strategic advisor. The owner, Mrs. Alvarez, looked skeptical. "The book business is complicated," she warned. "Are you sure you understand retail?" I smiled. "I'm a quick learner." We stabilized the store, renegotiated the lease, added a cafe, and turned the space into a community hub for readings and events. Revenue climbed. Foot traffic doubled. Mrs. Alvarez often told customers, "This place survived because I found the right investor, someone who respected the business instead of trying to control it." Sometimes my father visited the store with me. He'd stand quietly near the shelves, listening as Mrs. Alvarez talked about margins, loyalty, and trust. I could see him connecting the dots between Ironclad's downfall and this bookstore's success. The difference wasn't intelligence. It was humility. Years later, people still speculated about who really controlled Ironclad's fate. There were theories. Rumors. No proof. I never corrected them. Because real power doesn't need recognition. Real intelligence doesn't announce itself. And the best business lessons aren't about money at all, they're about knowing when to listen, who to respect, and never underestimating the quietest person in the room.